for urban green spaces, right? Like, you know, this is where most of us live. We live in towns and cities. It's time for lots of people to be involved in this conversation. So we've got two brilliant folks coming to speak to us today. We're going to hear from Hal Garner from Camden Council a little bit later. But first up, we're going to hear from Lucy Reid, who's Chief Strategy and Creative Officer at DemocracyNext, who specialise in this type of stuff. So let's give a warm digital welcome to Lucy, who's going to give us a short presentation and hopefully a bit of inspiration as well. So Lucy, over to you.
Thanks, Rory. The buttons here look a little different to where they were before, so just bear with me, folks, while I get my my slides up on the screen. And I might need some help with that because the buttons are in different places. Tech support. There it is. No, hang on. There it is. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Can you see my screen? Yep, great. Okay, thanks for that. Hi, everyone. So I've got just 10 minutes, and what I'm going to do in that 10 minutes is I'm going to give you a super quick primer on citizens' assemblies. And then the Nature Towns and Cities team asked us to share 3 reflections when it comes to including more people in decision-making. So first up, so I work for DemocracyNext. We're an international research and action institute focused on scaling high quality, empowered and permanent citizens' assemblies. So our mission is to shift who has power and how we take decisions in government and in other institutions of daily life. So we don't facilitate assemblies, we work to create the conditions for more people in more places to know how to make permanent assemblies happen, and then to tell stories from around the world of their impact on people and in policies. Just a reminder that the word democracy has come to be narrowly associated with elections and politicians, but it comes from the ancient Greek, from demos and kratos, meaning the rule of the people. And so here's where citizens' assemblies, which are one form of citizen-led decision-making, come in. So citizens' assemblies are structured spaces for creative problem solving. They're also known as citizens' juries or mini publics, and they're underpinned by 3 kind of core principles, so the magic ingredients, as I like to call them. So the first is sortition, which is the selection by lottery of a group of people who are representative of the local population. So there's a 2-stage process whereby in the first stage, a large number of invitations get sent out to a random sample of the population. And of those who express interest, there's a second selection by lottery where the group is stratified by criteria including age, gender, socioeconomic criteria, in order to bring together a group who are broadly representative of the community. The second principle is deliberation. So it's the opposite of debate, basically. It's led by skilled facilitators, and assembly members come together and they listen, they learn together, they weigh evidence, they learn from experts, including those with lived or personal experience of the issue being discussed, and they bring their own expertise and life experience into the room. They spend a significant amount of time together, so usually a minimum of 4 to 5 days, often longer, over a long time period, to grapple with complexity and find common ground. And the recommendations that make the cut are voted on by a supermajority, usually 75 to 80%. People receive payments or vouchers for their time, and thought goes into childcare costs, elder care, transport, digital support, in order to reduce barriers to participation. And then the third principle is rotation. So that is basically we take turns to represent and be represented. So the idea is an assembly gives enough time to engage with complexity, exercise collective intelligence, and find common ground. And so the types of questions that sort of assemblies are usually well suited to address include things like public policy, legislation, tough organizational decisions, it can be values-based dilemmas, complex problems that require trade-offs, and longer-term questions. So we're in what's been described by the OECD as a deliberative wave. So there have been well over now 700 assemblies in this most recent sort of stage of their use taking place around the world. And they tackle a wide range of policy issues, commonly environment and planning issues. So next, I'm going to show you a really short 2-minute video. We're going to hope it works, which comes from Ireland. And Ireland's one of the best known places for instituting and acting on the recommendations of citizens' assemblies, where assemblies have led to big changes in law, including on things like same-sex marriage and abortion. So fingers crossed this works.
There is something going on in the world right now. There is a hunger across the globe in political systems to get citizens involved in decision-making and policy development. And citizens want to be involved in this role as well. I'm going to tell you a story about Ireland and its experience with citizens' assemblies.
The level of inclusion and support to people to give their opinions and their values and to share that and for it to be considered and not shot down has been absolutely amazing.
The 100 people that you have in the room have to be representative of your society, all of it.
With the diversity, I've met so many people that I would never have come into my zone before, you know, unless it was in this environment, and it's really fantastic.
Everyone in our country can look into that room and say, I'm there, I'm represented there, that's me.
It's 100 real people, and I really do believe we've represented our country and our future generations really well.
We expose them to enough information and perspectives that they develop an expertise in the subject.
The information you've given me has changed how I see things and how I go about my day, so I'm really thankful for that.
And at the end of that process, then we ask them the question, what will we do about the issue of women's health? So the citizens recommended an abortion regime which was much more liberal than the government had expected. And they said, oh, let's see. So the citizens in the room, they voted 67 to 33 for this women's health regime.
I found that we were able to say things that perhaps civil servants couldn't say.
When the question was put to the people of Ireland in a referendum, the result was 66 to 34, which proves two things. One is that room was perfectly representative of the Irish people. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the Irish people were much more advanced in their thinking on this particular subject than the politicians were.
Thanks. So, basically, from my work at DemocracyNext and from my various roles as chair of a volunteer organisation and from my own neighbourhood, the team asked us to give 3 reflections, therefore, on including more people in decision making. And obviously, you've had a really super quick primer to citizens' assemblies, so I appreciate there may be loads of questions about that. But my first reflection is about shifting power. And understanding that is quite hard. So it's different to co-creation or consultation. It's a very different mindset and approach. And so while there's often a lot of focus on the assembly process itself, significant time up front needs to go into the commissioning organisation or organisations understanding that what the citizens recommend needs to be actioned, and that's really critical. So there needs to be really strong transparency and good feedback mechanisms. And in a government or local authority setting, it's therefore also really important that there's cross-party, i.e. governing party and opposition support for the assembly. It's not a partisan thing. And so, for instance, the Citizens Jury at Birmingham Museums that I've just advised on, the recommendations have been written into the organisation's new business plan. They are being shared publicly, and the co-CEOs are continuing to meet with the jurors over the next 18 months to continue the dialogue. And the reason why that's important is that this is all about building trust. So it'll be no surprise to you the sort of attitudes around trust at the moment. So the Edelman Trust Barometer, which many of you may have heard of, has been tracking trust globally for the last 25 years. And its latest findings show that there is this high sense of what Edelman describes as grievance distrust between individuals and institutions, so principally business, government, media, and NGOs, but also between individuals. So 61% globally of people have a moderate or high sense of grievance, which is defined by a belief that government and businesses make their lives harder and serve narrow interests. So citizens' assemblies and this kind of process build trust between citizens and institutions and between citizens and each other. This is very different to some other forms of participatory practice. And also you end up building with trust with relationships with people who you might never normally come into contact with, as was expressed in that video. And that is something that's hugely powerful to be a part of and to observe. So what might have been very scary in this case for museums, what if we don't like something that the citizens tell us, actually shifts into a place that is far more transformative and enabling. My second reflection is to citizen as a verb. Through this, what you end up with is people learning to citizen and becoming highly engaged in what happens next. People come away feeling empowered and purposeful. And so harnessing that energy has huge potential. So at Mosey Road Baths, where I'm chair of a community organisation that operates the baths, which are owned by Birmingham City Council, and where we're working alongside a really great coalition of partners, including National Trust, Historic England, World Monuments Fund, with support from government and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. We're working to save the building from being lost and to reimagine its future. And the first steps to saving the building came as a result of campaigning and community action. So how can we use some of the principles of deliberative democracy to ensure that once the building works are complete, we find ways to build on our citizen roots and really ensure that when we reopen, we continue to be inspired by and really led by our communities. And so to help our thinking, we're part of the Citizens Empower Network, which is designed to rethink the way that decisions are made in the cultural and creative sectors. Then my final reflection is on urban greening, which I know this conference is about, and it's kind of a personal what if that I'm going to finish off with. So where I live in Kings Heath in Birmingham, we have a hugely divisive low traffic neighbourhood. It was put in at short notice, implemented during COVID in quite difficult conditions, I think with last minute funding, and the aim was to reduce short car journeys. It has been hugely polarising. It's angry, full of grievance and entrenched views, and lots of cost to repair, damage to bollards and planters from people willfully driving into them, and time and energy spent on that. And so my final reflection is, could there have been a better way that might have done this differently, that would have saved all of this grievance and stuff that's really quite hard to manage? And so my premise would be a citizens' assembly or some form of deliberation to say, how could Kings Heath balance the need to reduce traffic congestion and improve road safety with ensuring fair access for all residents, businesses and visitors to the area? And my bet is that this would have led to a wider conversation about what's important, and that urban greening, placemaking, the wider environment, nature would actually have been a part of this. And so the great thing about deliberative processes is that they open up the space and the possibility for broader, bigger, bolder conversations and therefore better solutions. Thank you.
Bang on, Lucy. Thank you so much, and a brilliant ending there. So we've had a great overview of what a citizens' assembly might look like and what how it's been implemented somewhere like Ireland, and the sort of really powerful impact you can see from that wee film that Lucy showed there as well. So we're going to get straight into the practical, really, with Harold. So Harold's head of climate, air quality and energy at Camden Council. And Camden Council ran their own citizens' assembly on the climate crisis. So we're not only going to hear about the assembly itself, but also about how those actions, and Lucy mentioned this, how they've been taken forward and implemented. It's a crucial part for those commissioning organisations, in this case, a council. So Harold, over to you.
Thanks, Rory. That's very great. So thanks everyone for inviting me along today. Camden held the UK's first Citizens' Assembly on climate back in 2019, and to some of Lucy's points, it was really about rebuilding trust in politics. I mean, at that time, the country was really struggling with trying to get Brexit done. You'll all recall, and we were 2 or 3 months away from the prorogation of Parliament, so things were not great. And the leader of the council, Georgia Gould, who's now an MP, was really keen to bring citizens together in an open way to design policy across quite a contested issue, climate, where people could hear the trade-offs and where the resulting policy design would almost be people-centered, I guess, but would also kind of respond and reflect the needs of everyone living across Camden. If the next slide, please. So I use the word debate here, but it was deliberation. So 50 people were recruited using a sortition process into the assembly. It operated over 3 sessions across the summer of that year. There was a creche, there was accessible transport, we had interpreters, people were paid. It was a very sort of open process. In Camden, we're fortunate that we have some of the really great institutions like University College London. So the speakers were super high quality. We had Professor Mark Maslin, who opened the day with some really solid information about climate science to set the scene. And we then had speakers from engineering firms like Bureau Happold alongside campaign groups as well, to really help residents understand what they could do to address the issue. And then the final session was the action planning itself. We can move on, please. I mean, a really important thing with assemblies, particularly for an issue as broad as climate, is that you establish a framing question at the start that guides the session. So this framing question that you can see on the screen was the question we used, and we were very keen to introduce this spatial scale to it. So it ends with, what do we need to do in our homes, neighbourhoods and councils? So by giving the citizens that really clear focus, it really just helped to shape the proposals that resulted. I just also wanted to say that transparency and trust being such an important theme, the whole assembly, including this framing question and the speakers and the content of the assembly, was not designed by me and the council. We had an independent advisory group that comprised of the Director of Sustainability from UCL, the Director from Bureau Happold, and some of the campaign groups as well, so that everyone could really trust in the design that we were shaping for the event itself. We can move on. And so these are the proposals, the 17 proposals that were recommended. And, they're very people-centered and they're very high level, actually. And they are, in a sense, a kind of policy compromise. They were not policies that satisfied Extinction Rebellion and the members of Camden, Climate Emergency Camden, the sort of really strong campaign groups, nor were they sort of policies that were supported particularly by those who are very pro-car or climate skeptics. So it is an important outcome of an assembly that you often, not always, but you often end up with a kind of policy moderation position, which can be useful, of course, because it's more defendable in delivery and it's more easy for politicians to support. So these 70 proposals fed into our climate action plan itself. And although on the screen you can see they're about council, neighbourhood, home, the climate action plan itself sort of adjusted these themes into people, places, buildings and organisations to help structure things. So we could move on. I'm just going to talk a little bit about a couple of other things. So firstly, independence and transparency. So we wanted to be really transparent about the process. So we had an independent facilitator involved who ran the show. They wrote a report about it. We also brought in UCL to do an independent evaluation of the whole process, which was super important. These are all published on our website, still there. And one of the recommendations was to establish a citizen panel, to scrutinize our work, so that the two images on the right of this slide show the citizen panel as it established in 2020 during lockdown, the top one, and then move right through to 2025. So we've had this citizen panel, which also reflects the demographics of Camden, working with us throughout this whole process, right through the delivery of the plan. Onwards, please. So yeah, just very quickly, some sort of highlights from what's been achieved. So one of the real features of the assembly recommendations was about greening public spaces, and what on the back of the assembly we've really been able to mainstream climate resilience into all of our public realm projects. So we've not only tripled the length of segregated cycle lanes in Camden, but we've always installed sustainable urban drainage alongside them to help build that resilience. We've also planted over 500 trees every year, which was another recommendation in the assembly. So we've really delivered on what people wanted in that green spaces area, I would say. If we move on to the next, which is about our buildings. So we've spent a lot of time investing in retrofitting our buildings. We've secured about £30 million to retrofit our estate, and we've got a 64.5% carbon reduction across our corporate and schools estate now. And our new build, our own community investment program, which builds new council homes, is also delivering some very low carbon buildings. The bottom image there is our passive house scheme in Agar Grove in Camden Town.
Hello, everyone.
Ooh.
Jenny's final atrium
Which is
will begin in
our
5
chief executive
minutes
is
on
retiring
floor
today, so I
2.
hope you can hear that.
If you haven't already,
Is
please begin to make your way down.
that's Europe's
Thank
largest
you.
passive house scheme in Camden. Let's move on. And people, this is probably the biggest thing that's happened as a result of the assemblies. It's brought citizens right into the delivery of climate action in Camden. So the top left image shows Rack, who's got his cycle repair shop set up in Camden. We really support him. We've got the Fixing Factory top centre, that is a group that allows residents to repair electrical items in Camden. Bottom right image in the centre is Life After Hummus, which is a surplus food supermarket. They're taking loads of action themselves. We just enable and support them. And on the right of the screen, we just describes this brilliant partnership we have with Power Up North London, who are a community energy group in Camden. They raise finance through community share offers to fund solar on our schools estate. We've probably brought in about £7 to £8 million of grant funding on the back of our assembly model to help support these community groups over the last 5 years. Let's move on. So we're going to end with a little sort of film of our latest thing. So our new climate action plan needs to start next year. So we brought back the assembly, for those who wanted to come back, into a sort of lighter touch form of deliberation about what should happen over the next 5 years. And we also held events with schools, that's the top left image, and with businesses too, because they were kind of voices that weren't necessarily in that citizen assembly model. And we had we did this sort of community consultation process through from November of last year into April of this year. And the film that we will show now will just give you a flavor of what that looks like. It's not an assembly, like I say, but it really does capture the essence of what these things look like in practice. Just as that film is loading up, just 3 sort of recommendations or reflections. Firstly, really ensure that the citizen group closely reflects the diversity of the area, because if that's the case, then the policy outcomes are going to be stronger and more politically supported. The slides have disappeared from the screen, but I will come back to the other 2 after the film shows, which will just give you a really good flavour, like I said, of the session. Yeah, so the other two recommendations, like that film shows, you don't have to hold a citizens' assembly. There are lots of different models that have very similar outputs in terms of citizen engagement and an open process. And finally, the third one is really about independence and transparency. If you're going to do a citizen-led approach, you have to be very, very open about the process that you're taking. Which is why we had UCL do the independent evaluation, and why, of course, were involved too and wrote the report about the assembly, because unless people believe and trust in the process who weren't involved in the process, then they're not going to trust the policy outcomes or the programs of work that come out as a result of the decisions that are taken. So those are my three kind of reflections for the session.
Those are great, Harold. Thanks very much, and another brilliant video. Sorry to those that weren't able to see it, but it was joyful, and people were talking about their time and the experience. I hope you were able to see the first one as that Lucy showed, if not Harold's. We're going to have a conversation now, so we're going to bring both Harold and Lucy up, and really I'd like it to be led by the questions that everyone's already asking. It's great to see folk in the Q&A and bringing those questions through. I wondered if as somebody who's also been involved in a citizens' assembly, might just throw in a few reflections before we open that up. I was one of the folks who helped plan and design the People's Assembly for Nature, which was commissioned by NGOs, National Trust being one, RSPB and WWF being the others. It was run by Involve, who Harold's mentioned. So a slightly different model, because we, of course, as NGOs, we do have forms of power, but did not have the power to enact national level policy or do what a government or even a local authority might do. So I think this is to speak to that last point that Harold made, or second to last point, which is about not having to do a citizens' assembly. I would say what Lucy said is right. This is sort of gold standard. This is the best stuff. And if you are in a position to make a citizens' assembly happen, and I think some of the questions are going to come to this, I think it's a really effective tool. It's a really powerful tool. And actually, it saves you money down the line. So, Lucy talking about her example with the low traffic neighbourhood, the amount of time and actual monetary cost there's been to look after that place. What if there'd been a process up front? Yes, that it cost a bit more money than a consultation that goes on a council website and you can tick a box or say what colour do you like the planters to be, but rather a meaningful process where you engage people, you bring experts into the room, and you watch them step into their agency and ability to deliberate and discuss like grown-ups. And to me, what's always amazing about these assembly process is that people aren't daft. We always think, oh, what if we what if, one of the big concerns you might hear from councillors and others is that, oh, what if we hand over the keys to decision making and people come up with really bonkers stuff that we've got to try and enact? It doesn't actually pan out that way. And actually, there's a lot of interesting discussion to have about some of the more bonkers ideas that brings out something more tangible and more feasible. So I think it's a really powerful process, but there are many options for getting people to participate more and more meaningfully, and would welcome questions about how we do that as well. Yes, lots of good questions about citizens' assemblies, but remember, we do have that toolkit around co-design and co-creation, and we're in some ways good. We're not starting from a great baseline. Our baseline is very low for participation. That means there's a lot of space for us to step into in terms of doing things differently, not just running a consultation which gives people three options and says pick one. So with that, let's plunge into the conversation, and I'm looking at the Q&A here, and I'm going to use akin to Citizens Assembly where people vote at the end for their favourite options. We've got some questions here. So Dawn has asked how to encourage people to join a citizens' assembly who feel it's not for them and lack confidence to accept the invite. So Harold, I can see you've come off mute. I'll come to you first, and then Lucy, I'll come to you afterwards.
Well, yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, Lucy touched on it a bit, but you've got to pay people for their time, so that's really important. You've got to value people's time in this process. But when we did it, we also spoke to people because lots of people were concerned about joining the assembly. So we have a participation team in Camden who called people up. They talked them through what would happen. They reassured them of the process. People had concerns about, kids and all the usual stuff. So it's about the infrastructure around the process that supports them too. So I think you can make it happen, but you've got to hold people's hands a bit.
Yeah, I'd probably add to that, Rory, all of those things. There are also techniques through the sortition process that you can deploy. So you can oversample for certain areas. You can work with locally based organisations to encourage there to be more invitations sent out and then responded to by potential participants. And I think the other thing to note, though, is that so it is a challenge, but there are a lot of things in place to try and make it much easier for people to opt in. What I would say is once people do sign up for an assembly, and the hand-holding process that goes through the facilitation or the organising team really do a very good job of hand-holding people to get through the door first time round in a very deep and very thoughtful way, is you get very low drop-off rates. So once people are in and have done that first day, actually there's a very, very low dropout rate. People want to stay involved, and actually they want to stay involved after the assembly is finished too.
Yeah.
Bang on, and letting people know you don't have to, your expertise is your experience. When you come in the room, you're an expert of
Exactly.
you, of who you are and your background in your life. You're not there to represent any bigger cause or anything else other than yourself as part of your community. So I think that's the key thing really to emphasize. And the experts are there on tap rather than on top, right? So they're there to feed into the process to help people understand. Great question, Don. Thanks for that. Another really good one, and this does come up a lot. So this one is from Anonymous, and perhaps good reason for that. So you've asked why, love the Citizens Assembly, but how to prevent councillors from being challenged by this idea. And I've seen this number of times. Politicians often feel very threatened by the idea of citizens. I think the view being doing their job. I've heard those words being uttered by elected politicians. It's treated as a threat rather than as an opportunity. So, Lucy, maybe I could come to you first to answer that.
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's such a good question, and I think that's why a lot. So, as I said, when I was speaking, like a lot of the work goes into the process because it is a technical process, and Citizen Assembly is a technical process, and you need to understand how to do it. But that's why actually you need to spend almost as time up front warming people up to the idea, helping people to understand why it's a bit different, and actually how it can be really empowering for councillors. It can be a really good thing because a lot of the issues that councils tackle are really challenging. They're very multifaceted. They require a lot of deep, a very wide range of decisions that need to be made. And why would you not want some help and support to do that and to make decisions that actually you're going to come up against far less challenge further down the line because of the way in which those decisions have been made? And the only other point I'd make is that sometimes citizens' assemblies in this kind of process are kind of seen or cartooned as being some nice liberal lefty processes, but actually they're not. And I think there's been some research done now to show that more citizens' assemblies have been taken place not commissioned by lefty kind of governments. And in a recent poll that came out through YouGov and the Sortition Foundation showed that actually reform voters were more likely to think that citizens' assemblies would make decisions in their best interest more than members of parliament. So it's very easy to make assumptions around different types of politicians or different types of approaches. And so we also need to all challenge our own potential views about that, I think.
Anything you'd add to that, Harold?
Well, I just add that I think, Anonymous could reassure their councillor that they'd still make 95%, 98% of the decisions, and that you're really only using assemblies for those highly contested areas. And as Lucy says, that's when the value comes in, because they are so contested that a politician's going to be really grateful for that support.
Yeah, it's a confidence building exercise, right? You should feel like this is something that will get behind your back and feel that wind at your back.
And trust. It's about building trust in each other. And, we all know, all the politicians will know, how low scores of trust sort of for councils and politicians and political parties is. And this is a mechanism for building three-way, if you like, trust between institutions and governments and citizens and governments and citizens and each other, all of which are problematic at the moment.
Yeah.
And in Camden, sorry to add, just, in Camden, it's led to so much community action that it's saved the council masses of money effectively. We've got not everyone, but loads more people in Camden now really taking climate action in a way. They're almost like an additional team. So it's great resource.
That's a really nice segue, actually, Harold, because that's about building people's agency. And there's a question here which is asking how large an area or indeed small works for a citizens' assembly. Is this something that NGOs, charities can practically do? So I mean, maybe I can quickly say, I mentioned at the outset I was involved, in a citizens' assembly that was commissioned by 3 charities. So I think the answer is yes. It is a big undertaking though, and it is expensive. And I think in terms of area, they've gone from national level down to a London borough level in Harold's example. So I think it's pretty broad reaching. I think it's also worth thinking about those other tools though, and what power sits in your hands as a commissioning organisation to implement it. So if it's an organisation which has a nature reserve, for example, you could be bringing a group of citizens together and being very mindful of demographics, making sure you've got the right people in the room, asking the right questions as well, like going to people to think about the questions you're going to ask to make sure that you can do that type of work. So I think, it doesn't always have to be a citizens' assembly, depending on the funding you've got, depending on the capacity and time you've got. Yeah, Harold, anything else you'd want to add to that? I mean, you've obviously run one at a sort of borough ward level.
No, I think that's right. I think it can work at lots of different scales. I mean, Lucy's example of Ireland and, Camden's example. I mean, I think there's one in the chat from Kit Beaumont about, can it work at a low traffic neighborhood scale? I guess there are scales where it probably works better than others, but no major reflections.
Anything you'd add, Lucy, or maybe you could segue into Kit's question about how you might set it up for the low traffic neighbourhoods example, or whether it's appropriate or there's another model there.
Well, I mean, if you think about the easiest size of communities to work with, actually, the sort of size of a local neighbourhood would be really well suited, actually, to doing a citizens' assembly. And I guess, if I'd had my way, we'd have found a bit of budget. I mean, budget's the challenge for these things, right? But there are other ways, just as Harold said, and as you said, of thinking about how you use deliberation, how you use sortition as well, to enable different sort of elements of citizens' assemblies and the general approach to take shape. And I genuinely feel that it would have been so much. I mean, it's such it's just great. You go on to, if you ever go onto Facebook, onto the local sites, it's like every time anybody mentions anything about anything, it's all referred back to the low traffic neighborhood and just how it's really divisive in the local community. And I really do think that if we'd had that sort of a question, if the aim is to reduce traffic and short car journeys because that's better for the environment, and we have lots of really choked, quite small streets, actually, I feel that the collective intelligence of a representative group of people, and it doesn't have to be massive, some assemblies, there are the really big ones, but 25 people was the number, 26 people for Birmingham Museums, and they come with a really fantastic set of recommendations. And I absolutely agree with Harold's point that I think this would have led to all sorts of other really good things happening that would have been good for the local neighbourhood and would have been good for the councillors, who are always having to fend all sorts of, grumpy people making complaints to them about quite sort of things that could have been solved through this approach.
And I'm really interested at how councils might use the budget they've already got to do a consultation process, for example, which they're legally obliged to do. How could you retool that for a more participatory approach and not the money you'd spend on sticking it on a website and having a town hall that the 4 same people always come to? How could you use the same budget to do something new?
And just to add to that, Rory, I think the other thing that does is sometimes with the big planning decisions, like big city plans, or like there's a really great example of Denmark, of the island of Lynetteholm in Denmark, where they've decided to build a new island, and actually they're having to backtrack on a load of stuff because there's so much opposition to it. And now they've put in a citizens' assembly to actually ask how that should work and how it can work for the city of Copenhagen as a whole. So, these things could save time, and they save energy further down the line when you're having to defend something because it's had quite a narrow sort of consultation process attached around it.
Big time. 3 seconds left. We're about to be kicked out, but thanks very much to our speakers. You've been brilliant, and thanks for the questions.